webinar and then we'll move through.
Okay. Can I go now? So welcome everyone. This is our third meeting of the Independent District Commission. Today is March 13th, and I'm welcoming all of you. We will be meeting today from 6 o'clock through 9 o'clock. And I'm going to turn it over to our facilitators to go through the ground rules.
Adam, do you want to take that Zoom overview?
Yeah, it's not advancing. I apologize. There we go. So, hey, everybody, I'm Adam Briggs. I work with the City of Portland as the Transition Engagement Coordinator. Thanks for joining us tonight. And this meeting is being recorded, and it's going to be posted on the IDC Independent District Commission website under past events. We have closed captioning, American Sign Language, and Spanish interpretation available. You just need to click on the little button down in the lower corner if you want one of those, and they are available. Commissioners, please change your chat setting to everyone so folks that are watching can follow along. And community members, you can submit questions or thoughts through the Q&A. We had a sign-up sheet for the public comment period already, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to it.
Thank you, Adam. I am going to take a second to go over our meeting agenda for this evening. We're going to begin the meeting with some commission business, and then we'll be taking verbal public comment. We have 7 individuals that are signed up to testify this evening, and we'll have about 10 minutes slated in the public comment agenda for some commissioners to share reflections on the public comment received tonight. After public comment is done, we're going to have a quick 5-minute break. When we come back from break, we're going to spend the rest of the evening continuing to discuss district criteria. Unfortunately, City Attorney Maya Hyam had a family emergency and can't be with us tonight, but Autumn, the facilitator, is going to share Maya's responses for some of the questions that rose last meeting and subsequently. And then Flow Analytics will go over criteria versus data sets. By the end of the meeting, we're going to take a vote on whether to send any additional draft criteria to the public hearing. And as a reminder, our criteria public hearing is designed to seek public comment on whether any additional plan criteria should be considered. So with that, I'll pass it back to our facilitators.
Thank you, Commissioner. And I'm just going to review the commission business we have. Adam, do you mind advancing that slide? So today we have no excused absences, and of course, roll is included in all minutes. We will be moving to review and approve the meetings from the last meeting, March 1st, and seeking any final comment on the community engagement framework, and looking to pass that if the commission is ready. So we'll move on to the minutes. Are there any, one slide back, please. Are there any proposed changes to the meetings to the minutes from the meeting from March 1st? And if so, please use the raised hand function. And I'm seeing a request to commissioners, you all did receive the minutes in your meeting packet. However, Sophia, could you drop a link to that in the chat as well? Thank you. Okay. Okay. Now, are there any proposed revisions to the minutes from March 1st? Okay. Seeing none, please we use modified consensus. So seeing none, those minutes are approved. Okay, perfect. And we'll also drop Thank you. And we'll also drop the link to the community engagement framework as well. So we did review the proposed the line edits and proposed changes to the community engagement framework. There have been no additional edits, so the version you've received in your meeting packets is up to date. Are there any proposed revisions to the current version of the community engagement framework? And thank you for raising your hand. And yes, you can raise your hand to indicate change. Commissioner Lorente.
Yeah, thank you, Autumn. I would want to propose 2 changes to the community engagement framework, specifically under our objectives, bullet number 3. In that section, we call out and name specific communities that have not traditionally been heard or engaged by City Hall. My first proposed addition to this list would be to include Young Portlanders on this list. I'm just, reflecting on, here we are at the outset of a iterative process, and I think it would be both powerful as a statement of value, but also just, very helpful as well to get the perspective of young Portlanders who are going to be carrying this work forward into the future. So that's one proposal I would put forward. Secondly, I would also be interested in hearing from transit reliant communities. Just thinking about transit connectivity already being one of the criterion for us to be considering, I think it would be especially helpful to engage those folks as well. So just 2 proposals I would offer to the group.
Commissioner, one point of clarification for the transit reliant population community within the city. Are you proposing to include them under the 3rd bullet point as well?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Are there any other proposals from the commission? And Commissioner Chisholm?
Yeah, I just want to make sure I'm understanding our process here. The document I'm looking at has a bunch of red line edits. Those are already among the edits that we're considering here for approval?
Correct. These are the edits that reflect the changes discussed since the very, very original and incorporate the most recent changes from the last meeting, discussed in the last meeting.
They all look lovely. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. And Commissioner Siegel?
Do you need a motion to approve?
Pending a motion, pending the proposed revision to add young Portlanders and transit reliant communities to the 3rd bullet point. If there are no
Right.
other.
Correct.
Yep.
If one is needed, I'd be glad to make that motion.
Motion heard. Do I have a second?
Second.
Perfect. Okay, so we again modified consensus. So if anyone is in opposition to adopting the community engagement framework pending those changes, please use the raise hand function. And if not, okay, we have an adopted community engagement framework. Congratulations. So at this point, all of the foundational documents have been adopted. The follow-up to this, to the community engagement framework will be a community engagement plan that will essentially operationalize the values, objectives, and the guiding principles outlined in the framework. And that is the next step for the community engagement working group. And if anyone would like to join the working group, I guess I'd pitch this. It can accept more members and it's very fun. Okay. Sophia, I believe I can pass it back to you.
Thank you, Autumn. Yes. So now we're moving on to our next agenda item, which is taking verbal public comment. So we have 30 minutes allotted for this agenda item. Our co-chairs had shared earlier that we are leaving 10 minutes on this agenda item for folks to share some reflections on either the written or verbal public comment that has been shared with you all. So we'll start with hearing from our testifiers. We have 7 folks that signed up. Community members were asked to sign up ahead of time on our website. Our co-chairs are allowing our community members to have 3 minutes to share their testimony. Folks listening in, there's a little camera or a little icon that says blue sky timer that will start once you start sharing your testimony, and when you have about 30 seconds left, it'll turn red so you can know when your time is coming up soon. So we just ask that you please monitor your time. And yeah, so with that, we have 7 folks allotted or testifying today. If you did testify using a specific names attendee, we ask that you make sure that you're using the same number that you, or the same name that you signed up to testify with. So we're calling on the right folks. Once you come into our main room, you'll get a notification. Please accept that so you can come and share testimony. And then if you are presenting, or if you do want to share a slide while you're presenting, you're more than welcome to do that. So Adam now is going to put the order of public testimony in the chat. And so the first testifier that we have for today is Terry Harris. So Terry, I'm bringing you in. Terry in, let me see. Terry, make it in.
All right, can you hear me?
There you are. One sec. I'm going to pin you so that folks can see you. And when you begin, I'll start the timer.
Yeah, I'm Terry Harris. I'm glad to be the very first person to testify to this commission. Thanks you all for listening. I'm from Hillsdale. I submitted some detailed written comments to you last week, but I'll talk a little bit about it tonight. First though, welcome. Thank you for doing what you're doing here. I just have a couple early things for you to consider as you get started thinking about data and districting criteria. I was a vocal critic of the Charter Commission's decision to create multi-member districts instead of single-member districts. But now that the decision has been made by voters and handed over to you, it's important to understand that districting these new multi-member districts is similar, but not the same as districting single-member districts. In these large multi-member districts, both the geographic sensitivity and one-to-one accountability to voters is greatly attenuated relative to a proportionally smaller single-member district. But the threshold for election is much lower in a multi-member district. What this means is that the communities of common interest can be a smaller percentage of the district to be electorally relevant. So communities of common interest delivering only 25% of the electorate within a district should be electing their own candidate in this new system. But communities delivering 10% of the electorate in a district could be a major player. So what this means to you and your criteria discussion is that understanding communities of common interest will be the most important and the most difficult thing you do. And you need to do it with heightened accuracy because these thresholds for election are lower. For example, if you're going to assemble common neighborhoods into a larger community, you need good neighborhood level maps and neighborhood level demographics. But I would also say that assembling these communities of common interest should be your highest priority for balancing under your practicability standard, and certainly far more important than compactness. Once you get into this, you're going to understand that the broad brushed approach around Portland's common quadrants is going to miss a finer scale that might provide better district-based representation. So that's my main point. Some other points in my written comments though, if data or administrative issues are actual limits to your redistricting process, it should be stated as a criteria. Like if you don't want to split a census block, that's a criterion. It doesn't fit into the other standard criteria that you've been given in the charter. And if there's some election administration issue or preference, then that should also be a criterion and you should say as much. Finally, I think you need to number the districts, and the numbering has consequences as to whether the district votes in presidential years or off years. So you will need criteria and data to make that decision of how the districts are. I think the Charter Commission wanted turnout to be the factor, but I don't know if that was ever given in a direct charge to you. So that's what I've got for now. And like I said, I've got some written comments that go into more detail. Thanks. I appreciate the work you're gonna put into this.
Thank you, Terry. Up next is Debbie Kays. We do have Levi Cohen, but we do not see them. So if you are in the meeting with a different name, make sure to update your name. So Debbie.
Thank you. I'm Debbie Kay, President of the League of Women Voters of Portland. Thank you all so much for your service on Portland's first independent district commission. This is a big deal, a really big deal. Your current focus is on criteria to establish the boundaries of 4 city council districts. The League urges use of the criteria in the voter-adopted charter amendment. It was prudent of the Charter Review Commission to recommend criteria similar to those used in jurisdictions across the country, and even more importantly, that are consistent with Oregon law. Though you have the option of selecting additional criteria, the voter-approved list in the charter provides robust options to draw 4 large multi-member districts that will give Portlanders equitable, accessible, and proportional opportunities for more meaningful representation. In addition, focusing solely on the voter-approved criteria will build trust in the new process among diverse populations across the city. Just as the IDC is a great team, the Charter Review Commission was a similarly solid group that conducted extensive research across the city with an emphasis on historically disenfranchised Portlanders. The League was proud to be one endorser among the over 50 civic organizations, many representing communities of color. Much of this enthusiasm was linked to the criteria in the charter to be used by an independent district commission, all of you. The League firmly believes the criteria reflect common sense definitions and are readily understood. Priority ranking is not prudent and is not what the voters adopted. The IDC has the needed legal and other support to determine what constitutes communities of common interest, political boundaries, and the other site-specific dynamics that can all be comfortably weighed, excuse me, using the voter-approved criteria. We trust that this group is committed to gathering public input to inform the appropriate balancing of the criteria. The League thanks you again for your service and urges you to vote to use only the criteria in the city charter. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie. Up next, we have Melanie Billings-Yoon.
Can you hear me? I'm having trouble getting in.
There we go. We can hear you, Melanie.
Okay, thank you. Hello. I am Melanie Billings-Yoon, a former member of the Portland Charter Commission. First of all, thank you, commissioners, for stepping up and giving your time to implement the changes passed by Portland voters, granting them district representation and an equitable voice for the first time in over a century. I understand that the amount of information you must take in under this very tight timeline can feel overwhelming and confusing. Just as an example of confusing, some of the information you just received from Mr. Harris was incorrect. You don't have to number the districts in order to decide whether they're in presidential years or not. We put within the charter that the 2 districts with the historically lowest voter turnout would be the ones in presidential years, and the ones with the historically higher voter turnout would be in the non-presidential years. So that's one thing you don't need to worry about. Now I'd like to provide some context by explaining the criteria we did put in, and hopefully that will give you some level of clarity. I know that there's been a lot of talk and concern lately about the Voting Rights Act, so I want to put that to bed to begin with. A fundamental aim of the Charter Commission was to further participatory and growing democracy that would give voice to historically marginalized Portlanders, especially racial and ethnic minorities and lower income communities. Unfortunately, in addition to Portland being 75% white, our population is quite diffuse. We looked at maps with up to 12 districts, but no criteria could be imposed that did not create single-member districts with a majority white English-speaking population. That's the reason we ultimately opted for multi-member districts with ranked choice voting. By lowering the election threshold from 50 to 25%, multi-member districts give access to minority candidates and represent the district's diversity while removing the complexity and divisiveness of piling on specific criteria. And I want to stay on this theme of complexity and divisiveness. As you all know, trust in government, trust in Portland's government is very low right now. So this was a top concern for me as a commissioner and for our whole commission. Creating larger, more representative districts gave us confidence in using the criteria mandated by state law, as they provide the greatest flexibility over time to respond to changing local perceptions of, say, what constitutes a community of common interest, a neighborhood, a language culture, an economic center, without locking Portlanders of the future into the narrowly defined categories of the moment. That said, we did make one addition to the state rules, which bears explanation. And you've heard a little bit about this lately. Compact. Adding compact to the
I do have to jump in. We are at time.
Oh, no.
I do apologize.
Okay.
But you can feel free to submit the comment or speak again.
Will
You
do.
have to go to the, thank you so much for the comment.
Thank you. So up next we have Tim Larson, but we don't see a Tim Larson in the attendee world. So if you're out there in a different name, just make sure to rename. So we'll go with Chris Cooey. I think he's already in the room. Chris, did you make it in? Oh, I see you.
Unmuting.
There
Can
we
you hear
go.
me now?
Yep, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you and good evening and thank you to the commission. I'm Chris Covey, pronouns he, him. I live in the Pearl District. I have studied the creation of legislative districts for more than 50 years, including the 2021 compressed hearings of the Oregon legislature on state and federal redistricting. I wish to make 5 observations and suggestions about how the IDC goes about its work for Portland. The IDC should do its absolute utmost to reach its goal of preparing a plan of districts that comply with the prescribed criteria by this summer. Second, please do not bind yourselves unnecessarily by adding districting criteria not required by federal, state, or Portland law. The criteria passed by the voters in Measure 26-228 to be used in drawing districts are both valid and are consistent with Oregon and US constitutional standards. Speaking of perfection, there will be no single perfect map. You will be choosing among a range of compliant maps, all of which will meet the minimum criteria. 4, please have staff and experts of the commission conduct their own impartial analyses of Portlanders' own drafted maps submitted to the IDC using the specified criteria, and make these analyses of publicly submitted maps available online. Number 5, the single most salient geographic feature in Portland is the Willamette River. Of the 4 districts, one should be centered on the west side of the Willamette, the northwest, southwest, and south sections of the city. Portland west of the Willamette has about 150,000 people, out of the needed 162,000 for a single district. The additional 12,000 will be found on the east side of the Willamette. Existing maps, including those for the Multnomah County Commission, suggest how and where the additional 12,000 people can come from. On behalf of all Portlanders, please get this important job done, which was entrusted to you by the passage of Measure 26228. Please do not default this job to those who have an unambiguous and unmistakable conflict of interest in this process, the current members of the City Council. Thank you again for your time and effort.
Thank you.
Thank you. So up next, we have Laura Rogers. I think I just saw you.
Yes.
There we go. The floor is yours.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Laura Rogers. I'm a fourth generation. The video went off. There. I'm a fourth generation Oregonian and I live on the east side of Portland. I've been following your work with great interest. Today, I'm speaking to you about the standards for drawing our 4 new districts under the new charter. The Charter Commission, as discussed a minute ago, took its districting criteria directly from state law. Then, after 18 months of intensive research, consultation with experts, and extensive public input, it added compactness as a criterion. The result is a solid list of criteria which largely matches that which is in use by the state of Oregon and Multnomah County. After lots of education and
Have we lost audio?
Yes, Laura, you cut out for about 10 seconds there. Can you hear us?
Yes.
Okay, we can hear you now.
Okay.
Sophia, maybe we add 20 seconds back on the clock.
I'll also talk really quickly, and I don't have a whole big thing to present. Let's see. Okay, so the voters soundly approved these criteria at the election. They are robust over time and are designed to accommodate present and future changes to Portland demographics. It's been great to see how quickly most of you have come to grips with the map making process. You have engaged expert mapping consultants. Likewise, you have seasoned staff and competent attorneys supporting you. Now I urge you to rely on these people and move swiftly to consider each criterion in the charter only and balance them as you draw our maps. Finally, the work you are doing will make our city government more democratic. From my heart, I thank you for your service.
Thank you. And Sophia, did you see the two folks show up?
Yeah, so this is the last call for Levi Cohen and Tim Larson, who signed up to give testimony. If you want to just raise your virtual Zoom hand to see for where you're at in the attendee world if you're here. If not, we're ahead of our agenda, so we could accommodate a couple more folks that can share testimony. So if you're in the attendee tab right now and would like to share testimony with the district commission, just raise your virtual Zoom hand and we'll bring you in. Adam, how many folks? My attendee tab for some reason is missing. I can't see anyone. So
we have a hand raised from Ann Davidson.
Okay, Ann Davidson, let's bring you in. Okay, Anne, I think you just came in, saw your name pop. Okay, Anne, I think you just have to unmute and we should be ready to go. Anne, can you hear us? I think you just unmuted.
I did unmute. Can you hear me?
Yes, the floor is yours.
Okay, I don't really have any testimony. I don't know why I got called on. I sent in some written testimony, but I would have to say that I agree with the last people about using the criteria that the Charter Commission came up with and according to state law. So I don't really have any other verbal testimony. So thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Adam, do we have any other folks in that?
No hands raised at the moment.
Okay, so I think this is kind of the last call for folks out in the attendee world. If you want to share verbal testimony with the commission, just raise your virtual Zoom hand. Oh, I think I just saw one.
Yep. We have Vicky
And Samantha. Okay, let's start with Vicky and then we'll go to Samantha. Vicky, are you in?
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead. The floor is yours.
Hi. I just wanted to say I agreed with the last few people that mentioned legislative boundaries. I know that was brought up in the last meeting by Flow Analytics as one of the potential other criteria. And being a North Portlander, I think the way they're drawn, I think North Portland and Northern Northeast Portland have a lot of the same issues. And I think separating outer and inner East PDX is a good idea because they have different issues. And yeah, being in North Portland, if I got lumped in with like Lloyd Center districts, you know, I think that we have a lot of differing issues. So I think the Multnomah County district lines are a good guideline. Thank you.
Thank you, Vicky. And then Adam, did you say we had one more? Samantha, where'd you go? Oh, there you're coming in, Samantha.
Thanks, everyone. Hi, members of the commission. My name is Samantha Gladue, and I'm here on behalf of Portland United for Change. We are a coalition that championed Measure 26-228 and are now working together to support successful implementation of the measure. We're grateful for your service on the Independent Districting Commission and appreciate the connections you each have made to your values and your communities throughout this process so far. Thank you for forming a public engagement work group and prioritizing hearing from Portlanders. And as you consider criteria for districting, we wanted to highlight the vision and values-driven statements regarding districting, which Portlanders effectively said yes to when approving Measure 26-228 and the districting criteria that is now in the charter. Accountability. No matter what part of Portland we live in, our city government should represent all of us. Measure 26-228 will establish 4 city council districts with 3 council members in each district who are accountable to their constituents. Representation. When city council members are elected citywide, some regions like East Portland do not get fair representation or the same quality of city services. But when council members represent a specific geographic area, people living in their district know who to contact for help and can hold their elected officials accountable. And meeting community needs. With multiple council members representing a district, elected officials can work collaboratively with each other and communities to effectively find solutions to the problems we face. Council members will have a better understanding of what their district needs and how to solve local issues. Please adopt criteria that will serve and reflect the vision of Portlanders and that will be implementable and workable as you enter the next phase of your work to adopt the district plan. We encourage you to look at specific specifications provided in public comment from the League of Women Voters and Coalition of Communities of Color, which came through in written format for additional input on what this process could look like. And I want to bottom line again, thank you, and thank you for leading with your values and your communities.
Thank you, Samantha. So we have two more folks, and I think these will be the last folks I will take for tonight. So we have Steve and then Hank. Steve, I think you just came in the room.
Good evening. Can you hear me?
Yeah, your floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. My name is Steve Pinger. I'm representing the Northwest District Association, and I am forwarding a position that the NWDA took a year ago to the Charter Commission when they had not quite begun considering districting and the associated considerations around that. But the position that the NWDA took in March of 2022, which is still relevant, we believe, today, and we want to forward, is that the Northwest District Association asks the commission to employ the existing recognized neighborhood association boundaries as the basic geographic unit in assigning representative districts, and that school enrollment areas be considered an additional increment. These geographic areas represent the fundamental institutional and social infrastructure of our city and should not be divided or distorted. We oppose using precincts, census tracts, or zip codes for these reasons. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. And up next, we have Hank.
Hey, everybody. How are you? My name is Hank Shotland. I hadn't planned on testifying. I'm glad that there's a few extra minutes. And one of the things that I wanted to put a suggestion in your ears about is to think about to what level are people getting equal access to city services? If there are groups geographically based that tended to be underserviced by the city, then please do not break them into multiple different election districts, so-called cracking phenomenon. These folks who have been underserved need to have enough voting power to fully elect people who can make sure that whether they've been underserved with respect to transportation or parks or road improvements or sidewalks, that they have a nucleus and can get the services from the city that they've been denied. It's fine to talk about other kinds of criteria that are demographically based, but please look at the degree to which people have been underserved by the city. Talk to Flow Analytics about what proxy measures they might know about that could stand in for these because they're not available directly in any of the data that I've been able to find. And hopefully this will start to bootstrap some of the leveling of service levels across the city. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hank. So with that, that concludes our verbal testimony section of this agenda item. I'll give it back to you, Autumn.
Thank you, Sophia, and thank you to all of the members of Portland's community who provided comment today and have been attending these meetings and have also submitted comments written and to commissioners as well. So with this, we are going to adjourn for a 5-minute break. Oh, before we do that, Commissioner Chisholm, did you have a question?
Yeah, one quick, hopefully something can be taken care of during the break. We had two of our folks who provided testimony that had a disagreement as to a basic legal/fact question. Does the charter reform that was passed by the voters include the numbering scheme for the districts, or does it not include them? And if it doesn't include them, is that something, as Terry Harris suggested, something that we're supposed to do? If it is, I think we'd want to do it as part of this criteria process. I don't know. I've been doing a quick skim of the charter reform. It's a long document. So it'd be great. I know we don't have the city attorney with us today, but if there's any way to get that answer when we come back, that would be fantastic.
And actually, I made the mistake. I flipped it. I was gonna have us do the reflection after the 5-minute break. We're supposed to do it before the 5-minute break. So actually, let's take the 10 minutes to do the reflection now. If that works for everyone, then we will adjourn for the 5-minute break. So it's still fresh. Apologies. So we do not have, as you mentioned, we don't have the city attorney present. I will not weigh in on the legal role of numbering, but we can follow up on that specific item. I've made a note of that. Are there any other? No problem at all. Commissioner Lumley.
Thank you. There were a number of comments about the previous charter commission coming up with criteria and that it was well vetted, and I appreciate that body of work. Was it the intention of the charter that charter commission that would be the only criteria that should be considered, or did they just call that good enough for now and leaving it up to this body to consider whether additional criteria should be considered? Thank you.
And Commissioner Lumley, as a point of clarification, would you like to expand that question to the broader group just to discuss, or are you just highlighting a point of question that you have?
It might have to be something we come back and look at their record and come back at another meeting, because unless there's somebody that was involved in the former charter commission that could answer the question, but I'd like to know if it was their intent to limit the criteria.
I would point out, and we'll talk through the charter. We will walk through the charter requirements again later in this meeting. I can establish that this body has the right, and that is established within the charter amendment itself, to define additional criteria if you so choose. That's a part of this process. Now we just can't speak to intent. So, but this body does have the legal right to add additional criteria.
Great, thank you. That helps.
Commissioner Manjarrez and Commissioner Fleischman, followed by Commissioner Judd.
Great, thank you. I'm glad we have this opportunity for reflection before we get into the specific criteria. I just want to say that I really appreciate what the final commenter, Hank, I believe I missed the last name, mentioned about being intentional about addressing the needs of the diverse communities across the city. I think that's something that I was thinking about as we were starting into this space of public comment is there is criteria that redistricting processes generally use and engage, and that are sort of legal standard, I would say. And I think the Charter Commission did a good job of really aligning to those. But we are also sort of in a unique situation. We have a unique charge because we're not redistricting. So we're not sort of like tweaking lines around the edge. We're actually creating whole new districts. And so this is an incredible like opportunity and like a huge task. So I do want to just like name how rare something like this is happening and just say that I do think there is additional criteria to consider. And I was trying to like think about it, and I felt like Hank was really getting closer to it. And I think Commissioner Saxena mentioned this a little bit last time when we talked about public libraries, right? As an example, I think that if we could, through this conversation, clarify in the existing criteria where we are talking about public structures and public services and where those are included in current criteria and where we would need to potentially create another criteria to expand access to those. So the thing that's just moving around in my mind is having a criteria around equitable distribution of public structures and public services, and those might be different. And as I was looking ahead in the slides, I was realizing that there are some places where it might exist in the geographic and political boundaries criteria, which doesn't quite make sense to me. So I think as the presenters are going through and talking about the legal criteria where they can say, oh, we're covering these here, that would be really helpful so that when we talk later about public structures, services, institutions. And the things I'm talking about specifically, just to give some examples as I was listening them out, are things like libraries, parks, schools, community centers, government services, potentially affordable housing options. So I'm just putting those out there because I do think that this is a unique situation we're in. It's not just the tweaking of boundaries. So I just wanted to sort of say that as we get into this conversation.
Thank you, Commissioner. I believe in response to your comment, Commissioner Saxena did note in the comments, parks and libraries are not evenly distributed. So note. So Commissioner Fleischman, put your hand down, I think intentionally.
No, I put it down because I thought you'd recognize me, so I didn't want to.
Okay.
I didn't want to
recognize.
keep it up forever.
No problem. We'll go Commissioner Fleischman first, then Commissioner Judd, Commissioner Baldini, Commissioner Chisholm, and Commissioner Mount Harris. I think your hand is going down, so I'm not. So that order.
So I think my comments are partially an extension of what Commissioner Mount Harris just spoke about, which is in a little bit a clarification of what is or is not encompassed within kind of the existing criteria, and that would be helpful. Beyond that, I wanted to just express thanks to those who just offered their points of view. I thought it was very helpful. So those who are still listening in, just thank you for expressing those points of view. Also, as I was listening, and this may be helpful moving forward, is to clarify whether individuals are speaking as individuals or are representing organizations. So one speaker was associated with the League of Women Voters, another one with the Northwest District Association. Both of those, I assume, but it was not clear, were speaking on behalf of the organization. There was a former commissioner from the Charter Commission. I believe she was speaking as an individual, not for the Charter Commission. And I think it's helpful to be clear when folks are speaking in either category. It's just, for me, it's helpful to know. And the last is everybody who spoke was essentially making the case for for a number of reasons, sticking to the criteria as specified and arguing that they were broad or encompassing enough to be able to do our work and reflect the spirit and values that were moved forward by the Charter Commission. Notwithstanding that, I will be very interested in hearing what the case is to be made for the category called other criteria, not a specific other criterion, but the inclusion of other criteria. So I look forward to that because I'm sure we'll be getting into that. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Judd.
Good evening, everyone. First of all, again, thanks to all the public comments, both presented tonight as well as the ones that were additionally sent in. Are very helpful. I just wonder, this is a question the first question is for the committee. It does seem as if there is popular misunderstandings around what this specific commission is designed to do in the public comments. There was questions around ranked choice voting. There's questions around salaries and compensation, which is beyond the scope of this particular commission. So I wonder if there's a way to help folks understand that a little bit better. Maybe include that in the commentaries as we start in the meetings, or so just so there's a clear delineation between what's within scope for this commission versus what's outside of scope, because there seems to be some misunderstanding out there. And then the second thing is that the public comments are very, very valuable. At least I don't want to speak for everyone in the commission, but definitely for me. And I think one of the things that as we start listening to it, there begin to resonate certain themes. Obviously, we heard the criteria and the discussion around whether or not there will be a change or not to that criteria. I think the other one is around communities of common interest and what common interest, how are we actually defining that? And so it'd be really helpful because I haven't seen a clear definition about what that is. So getting an understanding from the public in terms of how they are defining that. And I think that's one of the things that the community engagement group was really interested in. That'd be really helpful as well if we can continue to have dialogue around that from the public comments.
Thank you, Commissioner. And probably for the end of this portion of the discussion, we'll have Commissioner Baldini and then followed by Commissioner Chisholm. We'll break and then we will start the fuller discussion around criteria. Commissioner Baldini.
Thank you. I just wanted to say that I found as everyone else, I found the public comments very helpful. And I really appreciated especially the reminder, even though I knew this in the back of my head, but it really resonated with me that these were approved by the voters. I think this is really something we need to keep in mind if we do consider adding another to this list. It's one of our tasks, in addition to coming up with these lines, is to come up with lines in such a way that generates legitimacy for the future city council. That is, we want people to increase their faith in our city government, which, as one public commenter noted, is very low. So if we add on to this, I want us to be very conscious and very careful that of how we do it. And the other thing I wanted to say is, it's my understanding, and I hope someone corrects me if I'm wrong, is that we can absolutely prioritize parks, libraries, other things that we learn over the next several weeks, even if we don't mention them or anything like them in the criteria, right? The criteria is basically, it fences us in, but it doesn't mean we can't really take seriously these other things that matter. So I just wanted to highlight that too. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. And Commissioner Chisholm, will you round us out?
Yes, I'm gonna, as it turns out, extend on Commissioner Baldini's comments. It's really important, I think, for all of us to understand the difference between formal criteria and informal goals. I share Commissioner Manjarrez's desire for equitable division of resources, although perhaps there might be communities whose common interest is they don't have enough resources. But for example, if we were to set a criteria, I'm not a lawyer, I will say this, but my experience with this sort of process in the past is, if we were to set a criteria that every district should have the same number of libraries in them, and then we miss that, there's 19 here and 20 there, we create an opportunity for a legal challenge to the maps, having failed to meet the criteria that we set out at the beginning of our process. So we can have lots of informal criteria. All of us have our own goals, things we hope for and wish for and want to see. And I think that's very valuable. That's what we're here to do, after all, is to balance all these goals. But the formal criteria, same number of bodies, contiguous, as much as practical, compact, 4 districts. That seems to me to be the, we have to have a really strong reason to do something beyond that. Is my take on that. So I just really weigh the difference in your mind between informal goals and formal criteria for sure. And yes, as Commissioner Saxena said in the chat there, all this data goes into the mental blender that we're using, each of us individually. That's why there's 13 of us here to weigh all this stuff together. So I really appreciate all the comments from the public, from each of you, and just looking forward to finally getting our hands on this conversation. Thank you all.
Commissioner Manjarrez, did you want to jump in?
Yes, I need to say that I absolutely agree. I think we should be very thoughtful about the addition of any criteria. And I also want to just make a request, I guess, about being clear about when we're talking about data sets versus criteria, because I do think the criteria matters in the sense that we don't want to have a set of formal criteria and then have a lot of informal conversation. I think that will be very confusing to the public along the way. And I do think that within these criteria categories, we should just be very clear about what data sets that entails. So I think it's more of a let's be very transparent at this stage about what's included in the criteria that's on the table and where we would need to expand in order to have that more expansive conversation around how we think about sort of the parameters of how we set up these districts. So I don't think they're a mutually exclusive conversation. I agree that they're at different levels and we should be thoughtful, but I do think that we don't want to set up different sets of criteria and we want to be consistent along through the process. So I just wanted to say that I think we're all in agreement. I just wanted to clarify the point I was making and to say that I agree 100% in that we shouldn't tie our hands in terms of saying it has to equal this number. So notice I said equitable and not equal. And also I think there's ways to put in language that wouldn't put us in a bad legal situation. I am a lawyer, so I will just say that.
Thank you to all the commissioners for your reflections, and again to members of the public for their comment. We will adjourn until 7:02, so 5 minutes. We'll come back here and we will probably have a bit more time than budgeted in the original agenda because that legal review will be a little bit shorter. So see you in about 5 minutes.
We're going to recess, not adjourn.
Oh, did I say recess?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioner Lumley, recess. start in about 30 seconds. Okay, seeing folks start to come back off camera. And both, I think both interpreters back on too. I think we can get started. Adam, do you mind advancing that slide to the next one, please? Thank you. So, full disclosure, as always, I am not an attorney. However, we will be talking through just as a way to kind of focus on the scope of the work here. As was mentioned during the reflections, we're going to review the charter requirements. And then I also have a few follow-ups to questions posed in the last meeting from Maya, the city attorney. So I will share her views on those. We'll start with the charter requirements, and then we will move on to the responses from the follow-up questions. Okay, so following along here on the slide, the IDC, the Independent District Commission, is here to prepare and adopt the districting plan, again, that establishes four districts for the election of city councilors. You will use the voter-approved district criteria to develop that map. And so this is what the last 2/3 of this meeting are going to be focused on, discussing those criteria that will be later used to draft those maps and identify any additional criteria in addition to that you may want to adopt, in addition to those that are required by the charter amendment. You're not actually required to adopt any additional criteria, as we've discussed in prior meetings and in this one. And in today's session, for instance, you could choose to adopt draft criteria to send that to the public hearing that'll be held on March 22nd, but you are not required to. You could also choose to adopt additional criteria after the meeting as well. So just to be clear. The first meeting, again, the one I just referenced, be early in the process. That's currently scheduled for March 22nd. And that meeting is really set to happen before you begin drafting, before you begin exploring potential plans being the actual maps. This meeting is required to have public comment that are related to the district criteria and any potential additional criteria that you may be considering. It also, just as the public comment today, was also included responses about the set criteria that are already in the charter. This upcoming meeting will also allow for public comment on that issue. Now, the second set of public hearings will happen after you've actually worked on drafting the plans, drafting the maps, and you have draft maps to propose to the public. You're required to have 2 public hearings in each proposed district before voting on that plan. Those districts need to be held in July, essentially a month before the adoption, in the month ahead of adoption. So the draft district plan must be made available 1 month before the first hearing, and the commission can't vote on the plan until a month after the last one. So that is why that schedule looks that way. And then finally, the plan needs to be adopted by the 1st of September of this year. If nine commissioners do not vote to adopt the plan, and after 2 attempts, it would then go to the current city council to vote. For their consideration. And it's that most recent plan that would go to the city council for their consideration and adoption. So that's the overview. That's the scope of the work and the focus of this body going forward. And that is the kind of the minimum that the body needs to do from a legal perspective. I'll pause there and see if there are any comments on this body of requirements or any questions. Commissioner Chisholm. And followed by Commissioner Fleischman.
We put out a draft plan. We then hear from the public. Presumably, we're going to learn some things from the public. If we do, that cause us, a majority of us, I suppose, to ask for changes to that map, we can then change that map, right? We can amend the map after we get the public comments. Not resetting the clock on having to do it all over again, the 2 months of hearings again?
Correct. Because the final plan that you'll actually, so you'll have these hearings, the public meetings, the public hearings. If there are changes, then as a body, you can adopt those changes, you can change the plan and amend the plan based on what you hear, the discussions that you're participating in. And you'll get those 2 attempts to vote on that plan.
On just that plan, or we have a vote and it fails, then we can propose additional amendments and then we vote again?
I believe you get 2 votes.
I can step in here, maybe.
I can file, yeah.
Yeah, so you all get 2 official votes to vote on the final plan. And so the earliest that can happen is at the August 16th meeting, because there's that requirement that you have to wait 1 month after the last public hearing. So what we hope to do with you all throughout this process is to have like temperature checks to see where folks are at, or straw polls, but not official like roll call votes where we have folks like individually raise their hand, if that makes sense.
It does, thank you.
And Commissioner Fleischman.
Yeah, thanks. Sophia, this is an extension of the question on voting. So it sounds like there are two opportunities for formal votes, but they don't need to occur at the same meeting. So there could be work done, whatever deliberation, so that at a subsequent meeting we take a vote. But what this means is 2 formal votes that seek to achieve the 9 vote supermajority. Is that an accurate description?
Yeah, and maybe the way to describe it is like 2 formal votes. And that's the earliest we can do that is August 16th, where we'll take one. What I had put out in your work plan, that the first vote would be taken on August 16th. If you would all adopt the plan on the 16th, then great. We spend the following meeting talk about community education. But if for some reason you don't agree at the 16th, then we would take another vote on the 21st or 22nd. I can't remember the next meeting. But we would take straw polls or temperature checks, however we want to call them, throughout there, so that we know what folks, and so community can kind of see where we're going.
Commissioner Lumley, and then Chair Saxena. And Commissioner Lumley, you're on mute.
There we go. Sorry about that.
Perfect.
So July is an opportunity for a lot of public input. And after that, I just want to confirm there are no other opportunities for public input. It'll be just the commission work only. Is that correct?
I do not believe that is correct. So, but it depends also on what you mean by public input. So for instance, there are other mechanisms. If you include other ways to be able to hear from the public, written comment, potentially if you, not having public hearings, but if there are other mechanisms you wanted to use, those two public hearings, those formal public hearings are established by statute, but there are other mechanisms you could use to consider to continue engaging. That is my understanding.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you.
And Commissioner Saxena.
Yeah, no, thanks for all this, Art. So by July, are we required to have narrowed things down to one proposal, or is it possible that we could be going out with multiple proposals with the same general districts? Is that a possibility as well?
My understanding is, yes, you can have multiple plans that you present and want to get feedback on. You can have one, you can have a few, but that is my understanding.
Great.
And I believe in the presentation later, Kimmy may speak to that directly. Sure. And Commissioner Siegel.
Thank you. I believe there is also mention in both our meeting packets and other preliminary materials that the requirement is that we have a minimum of one hearing on the criteria and a minimum of 2 hearings in each proposed district, which says to me that there's the opportunity to consider additional hearings if warranted. Thank you.
And that is correct. Those are minimums. And it's that the district plan just needs to be made available a month before the first one. And you can't vote until a month after the last one for the formal public hearings.
I'll just step in here really quickly. I don't want to take up too much time, but all I'll just say is that we do have a very tight timeline, right? I think we all are aware of that. But now that you all have approved your community engagement framework, Adam and the community engagement work group will work to plan out your community engagement strategies and then propose different engagement strategies that can help inform your process. And so we'll come back to you all with like a revised community engagement plan so you all can take a look at it to help, so we want as much community engagement as possible, I'm sure as you all do too.
And that community framework, the community engagement framework is the document that and the set of values, principles, and approaches and strategies that informs that community engagement plan as well. Okay. If there are no other kind of like immediate questions on the charter requirements, I did want to revisit the questions from the last session. So, sorry, the questions around legal, and these did go through legal review. So the first question was, what is the functional difference, if any, between not dividing communities of interest versus preserving communities of interest? And there was discussion around that language being used more frequently in other districting processes. So the response from Maya, the city attorney, that there's no functional difference between the two. The criteria language in the charter is taken directly from Oregon State Statute 188.0110(1D), section 1, subsection 1D. Each district, as nearly as practicable, shall not divide communities of common interest. So those are just aligned. And Commissioner Manjarres.
Yeah, if there isn't legally any functional difference, I would prefer that we use the one that is more affirmative than the not divide communities of interest, and I'm forgetting the language for that.
So the criteria, so the functional
or
difference.
Can you read them both
there
again?
is no,
Sorry.
Sure. So the two, so it's dividing communities of interest versus the actual charter language, which says preserving communities of interest.
Yes.
Or actually,
I think
sorry,
that's
I flipped that. Sorry. Yeah, I flipped it. Sorry. Dividing communities of interest is what's used in Portland's charter versus I think there was statements that other processes have used preserving communities of interest instead. Portland's charter is the requirement that you do need to use. It is mandated, and it is tied specifically to Oregon state statute.
Okay, so we have to use that particular, functionally, you're saying that they're legally interpreting it as no functional difference, but from our perspective, we have to. So let me clarify. So if we're using that criteria and I'm, for example, saying, oh, we would like to preserve this community of interest, that's like the same as we wouldn't want to divide this community of interest, and that would be treated the same.
That
Okay,
is the
that's my-
position. That's correct. That's the position
Okay,
from the
thank you.
city attorney's office. And that's the question she was asking too, just the functional difference.
Great, thank you.
Number 2, what is the possibility and legality of splitting census blocks if it's meant to adhere to existing political, neighborhood, or other boundaries? So the response from legal. It's legal, but courts find the practice highly problematic and it would be against established best practices. So that's on splitting census blocks. And number 3. Oh, sorry, any questions on that? Commissioner Lumley.
It sounds like you're reading from something, but we just see the one page. Is there something in writing that we're supposed to be receiving?
No, these came right before we can send them out in writing, but actually, Adam, do you mind dropping this slide for a second? Just so I don't have to read and hear both. And sorry, Maya would have been here to present this, but she did have a family emergency right before we started.
Great. We'll see if receiving them in writing would be great. Thank you.
Perfect. And the 3rd, does the commission have to formally adopt the criteria prescribed in the charter? And we did discuss this a bit earlier. No, the criteria in the charter is binding and does not depend on the IDC taking action on those specific ones. So you don't have to formally ratify the existing requirements in the charter. However, if the IDC wants to adopt additional criteria, it must take a formal vote to adopt those criteria. Okay, so that one's a bit of a process, more of a process question. Okay. And I don't have anything else there. I think we can move to Kimmy and your presentation from Flo if there are no questions from the commission. Okay. Kimmy?
Hi, good evening, everyone. Can you all hear me? Okay, great. Sorry, I'm on one screen and it's a little unsettling for me. So I'm going to share my screen and hopefully we will. Okay. Sorry, give me 1 second. Okay, so you should all be able to see the slides at this point. Okay, fantastic. So this is just intended to be an overview of the district criteria, and any questions that you have, please feel free to raise your hand. I have sort of a limited view, so I've asked Autumn to assist me if she sees hands raised that I may miss. So please feel free to answer questions at any point during this presentation. So these are the criteria. I'm not going to read them out because I think we're probably all at this point familiar with them. And I do want to start with this piece at the beginning, that as nearly as practicable. And I think that it's just a quick important point to note that particularly when we talk about the 4 districts and how they need to be of equal population, it is really, really unusual to get districts that are exact in population. So just bear that in mind. And I think when we talk about all of the other criteria, it really is just as nearly as practicable as we go through. So the first one is be contiguous and compact. Contiguous is really something that is intended to, that you don't need to travel. If you're in one district, you shouldn't need to travel through 3 other districts to get from point A to point B. So this is in California, in Southern California. This was the 2011 assembly seats. And you can see that this particular district, to go from the West Hollywood Star over to Santa Monica College, you actually have to travel completely through another district to get there. There was actually no way to be able to get there any other way. It's not a fantastic contiguous example. In 2021, they fixed this and the maps are not yellow any longer either, which is nice to look at. So in 2021, you are able to travel from West Hollywood to Santa Monica College without leaving the district. So this is a better example of contiguity. Using existing geographic or political boundaries, again, this is looking at rivers, highways, major arterials. For geographic examples, political boundary examples do include school district boundaries. And I know that one of the public comments earlier had been in reference to using neighborhood area boundaries as well. So that's another, those are the geographic and political boundaries. So not divide communities of common interest. I think that it is a good discussion for the commission to have about not dividing communities of common interest. This is really a criteria that's been recognized by academics and jurisdictions throughout the country. And it's really about typically in districting processes, it's about groups that share common policy interests. And those policy interests can really be a broad range. It could be about maintaining parks or maintaining, making sure that there's dog parks in every neighborhood or other policy issues which are important to those communities. And so when we talk about not dividing communities of common interest, again, I'm going to refer you back to as nearly as practicable. We often find that within the districting process, there are sometimes trade-offs that have to be made and concessions along through the process, especially when it comes to looking at the maps. And here are my examples. Dog owners who frequent the same dog parks, groups of parents whose children attend the same school. And this often comes up because if you have kids that are walking to school, then the safety, paved sidewalks and functioning streetlights and all of those things become important. The next one is to be connected by transportation links. And this is really about trains, buses, existing transportation routes that exist already within the city. This would be, generally, we look at sort of metro level transportation links. We did have a request about school district routes, and they are something that we can map, but they do also change with some regularity from year to year. So typically we'll look at sort of more of those metro routes in terms of light rail or buses. And then we're down to the equal population slide. And again, this is as nearly as practicable. Alex talked about the deviation in his prior presentation. And I think that we can go over that again, and we will go over that again when we get to the mapping portion. Commissioner Chisholm? Oh, you're on mute.
Commissioner, you're on. Yeah.
3 years in, I still can't unmute. We had written testimony submitted to us that suggested that we ought to consider defining what our guardrails are on equal population, how much deviance we're willing to accept from perfectly equal before we get into the map drawing process, so that we are doing it in a way that is sort of honest and above board and not deciding on how much variance we're willing to have based on what one map or another is favored. Do you recommend that, or do you recommend that we give ourselves the maximum flexibility down the road with mapping or not?
I would always err on the side of maximum flexibility. I think that oftentimes entities that have goals around their deviation have a population that maybe is very stable, and from year to year there's not a lot of change, but we do see that there are also, on the flip side of that, if you hold yourself to, say, a 3% deviation, and then you have a massive construction project or a natural disaster where people may be moving from one area to another, and then you get to the next census, all of those numbers could be off for very good reasons. And you might want to be able to sort of account for some of that within those deviations. So 10% or under is sort of considered the federal standard, but typically speaking, most maps can get to 5% or under. because the mapping technology has improved so much. But I would encourage you to maintain the most flexibility as possible. So
That makes sense. Certainly seems to me we'd want to prioritize communities of interest over slavish dedication to numbers. So thank you. Yeah, appreciate it.
Yeah. And so these are the two shall nots within your criteria. The first one is not drawing districts for the purpose of diluting the voting strength of any language or ethnic minority group. And this is a sort of a direct link to the Federal Voting Rights Act. The city doesn't have a majority, what would we reference as a majority minority district within the city lines. And so that would represent an ethnic minority group, excuse me, in the census, and Alex went over this again the last time. It's, you know, Asian populations, African-American, Native American, and I forget the fourth one. And so, but the city itself, we don't feel has a group that is large enough or geographically compact enough to be able to consider under the Federal Voting Rights Act. And so this last one, and districts may not be drawn for the purpose of favoring any political party. It's a federally upheld principle. Elections are very political, but the process of districting actually should not be political. And so that is kind of that one, that's that last kind of shall not. And so we sent this to you in a memo as well. And this is really just sort of outlining the data that we use that sort of correlates back to each of the criteria in case anybody had any questions. We will, the equal population, I did forget to mention, we are required to use the 2020 census data. And I would say that no census is ever perfect. And certainly the 2020 census had its own very unique challenges with the pandemic. So Commissioner Fleischman.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to go back for a moment to that final criteria, not favoring political party. In a municipal context in which parties are not identified, or in which you have more than one potential winner, because we have multi-member districts. Is there any, like, how does that rule get applied?
Well,
if you're not explicitly running on a party or a set of recognized parties, you might be running, there may be factions there, but so how does that apply?
It's really, this is really only germane to drawing the districts. So when we start the process of mapping, for instance, and the commission, the commissioners have already, you guys have already requested some data sets, and I'm sure there's more requests that we'll see coming in. But for instance, if you were to say, we would really like a map of all of the Republican and Democrat voters in the city of Portland. It's not that it's not data that's unavailable. It's rather just that we would not want to create an influence of any kind when drawing the districts on a map for the purpose of favoring a political party. And so really it's a shall not, but it's also a little bit, I think when you have a situation like in the city of Portland where you have multiple interests kind of running for seats, I think it really is just the role of the commission is to be as apolitical as possible when looking at drawing the district maps. And it does kind of link back to the communities of interest and really getting that information from them. So that's what I would say. I think if you had a Republican Party stand up and say, and try and influence this process, that would be, I think, a little more problematic than if you had neighborhood associations or groups of other people putting forward their information. I'm not sure if that was the clearest answer for you, but.
For the moment, clear enough, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay. Commissioner Manjares?
Yeah, I have a question on a totally different subject, so it's going to the next slide.
Okay.
But appreciate the clarification on that. I think I'm having a little bit of a disconnect, and this relates to what I had mentioned earlier, where when you look at the criteria example on the top, and so I don't want us to have to create extra criteria if we can be more explicit in the current criteria. So when you look at the criteria in the previous slide, there's 2 examples that are given. One, if you go up one more slide, sorry.
Okay.
Or back one more slide.
Oh, back, sorry.
Yeah. The 2 examples that are listed here make intuitive sense to me. So one of them is about naturally existing features, and the other one is more political boundaries. And I had mentioned earlier just wanting to have some data and information about the geographic distribution of public structures and services. And I think you include that on the next piece. So when you're talking about community centers, things like that, I don't feel like those fall within one of these 2 bullet categories. That would be like a 3rd bullet that would be included. And so I guess my first question is, when you're naming this district criteria and you have these bullets sort of laid out, is this what was included in the criteria established by the Charter Commission, or are these just 2 examples that you all inserted?
So the criteria is using existing geographic or political boundaries. And so below that are just examples of different boundaries. There are probably more examples than what we have listed there.
Great, because I do think, again, this is going to determine whether I advocate for more criteria or not, but I think that if in the existing geographic and political boundaries, we could include a 3rd bullet consistently that talks about geographic distribution of public structures and services, I think that would be fine for me to just be more clear with the public what we're talking about here, because I didn't see it in that criteria before. But when you're looking at the data sets in the next piece, I do see it sort of as an example on a few pieces. So just wanted to clarify whether that was a possibility in this existing criteria.
Absolutely, yeah. And we've certainly worked with clients before that have used wanting, a park in each district or those kinds of things. So, yeah.
Great, thank you.
And there's one more comment request, Commissioner Vincico Robbins.
Oh, you're on mute.
I just wanted to say, and I mentioned it in the chat, that I'm struggling with, for me, communities of common interest gives us a lot of flexibility about what we consider. And we'll hear a lot, I would assume, from the public about how they view their own communities of common interest, what's important to them. And we clearly heard some tonight from the public comment about existing neighborhood district boundaries or the school boundaries for particular schools. But I would also assume that there are going to be a lot of people in Portland who have historically been underserved by city services and don't have access to libraries or parks or sidewalks, and they're going to feel that that is a community of common interest. So I think that the way I look at it is that communities of common interest are going to give us a lot of different overlays of data that we can lay on maps and try and find the best way to accommodate those communities of common interest while honoring these other criteria. Mm-hmm. So I lean toward not adding more criteria because I view a couple of these criteria as giving us a lot of flexibility for what we consider.
Commissioner Laurenti?
Yeah, I had I guess, a quick question on the criterion be connected by transportation links. I'm just curious, in your previous work, if you've seen or noticed if major transportation links, has that primarily been used as a like a division between districts, or treated more as an amenity of districts? And I'm sure it's a little bit of both, but I'm just curious to hear from your previous work if that has traditionally gone one way or the other.
So I can tell you in my experience, it tends to be a function actually leaning towards contiguity, in that it's a way for people to travel within the district. So if there are transportation links, if there are, for instance, bus routes going from one district to another district, but that stay within, right? So you can travel from point A to point B within your district along bus routes, and also then to wherever you need to go. So those are kind of the transportation links that in my experience I've had. And I know that Alex is listening in, and I don't know if he's got anything to add in there, but typically speaking, that's how we use transportation link. Not so much as, they can be used as a boundary, I suppose, but transportation links also change. And so typically they're just used more in a sort of a, can you travel from point A to point B? And is that, you know, if those are, and I think, you know, in rural areas that gets a little more difficult. I think in a city like Portland, you have much more, you know, you have a lot more options there.
The only thing I'll add, Kimmy, is I agree. And on the flip side, transportation, major thoroughfares often just naturally become boundaries, because that's what the census blocks are also potentially using to define them. So there might be some common boundaries or common, you know, roadways that we think of in Portland that might end up being boundaries. And that's just by default because of being built up from census blocks.
Mm-hmm. Commissioner Judd?
So, Kimmy, I'm struggling with this question that's on my head, and I'll just ask it. So, if we were to imagine Portland, I'm just going to throw out a round number, consisting of sort of economic dollars of, let's call it 100 million, right? And we were, well, let me start it a different way. One of the things that we have on here is, you know, based upon equal population. Are there any, in your experience, measures, overlays that were based upon either economic consumption or investment that were used to help define boundaries?
Can you tell me a little more about that?
Yeah, here's what I'm thinking. So I'm not saying this is the case. I'm saying if this was potentially the case, let's say you had one district that consumed historically, you know, 60% of economic investment. So that means the other 2 through 4 districts really weren't getting their level of investment, particularly in that representation, for whatever reasons. I'm just kind of curious if there was anything that would be considered to be a part of a criteria that would allow you to conduct that type of overlay, and basically, has there been something like that used before?
So I'm not sure that I've seen anything used like that before. However, I do know that there is data on zones within cities, oftentimes, especially if they're getting federal funds, you know, for investment purposes. Then, and I can't remember exactly the name of them off the top of my head. I want to say empowerment zones, or I don't remember exactly. So, but there are federal funds that come into cities that we could, in theory, sort of map out where those funds go to, if that's what, is that kind of along the lines of your thought process?
Yeah, it's just in terms of either investment, municipal resource consumption. If there's been something like that used in the past, that was a part of the criteria that you were aware of.
Yeah, I think we could probably get pretty close to that based on federal data.
Right.
Commissioner Wise?
Thank you. My question, so I guess my concern right now is that even with the criteria that we have, that some of it, like, we may run into the issue of some of our goals being conflicting. So like, for example, I was thinking about, we've been using the example of regions in which Portlanders have not received adequate services, right? So in a scenario in which there are, we have identified a group of common interests, like these sets of Portlanders are not receiving these services, and they're on different corners of the map, and they're not connected by transportation links. I guess my question is how, in your experience, like, how have other commissions kind of dealt with that? Is that just purely, through our through debate, and we just kind of like do the best we can, or do we have a responsibility to make sure that that community is connected in some way?
So I would say that the criteria around not dividing communities of common interest is probably one that fits best in this arena, primarily because, and I say that, but the reality is that you may have multiple communities of common interest that geographically may not all be able to be kept whole. And so this is kind of one of those things where it is as nearly as practicable. And oftentimes with commissions, they have to make choices that divide one community in order to preserve another community, and it can get a little difficult. So I would say that that is probably part of the dialogue that you as a commission would need to have and to kind of walk through as those communities come forward and as we're able to map them. That is another piece with the communities of common interest, because we need to be able to map them. They sort of do require to be geographically within the same area. And so if you have a need that is spanning, the width of the city, that gets a little more difficult for us to be able to map and then, put in districts. So I think that it's important to identify where these folks are, though, on a map, so that we can best sort of be able to determine, so that the commission rather can best determine how to, preserve them and sort of bring those to light. Does that help? Okay, do we have any more questions on the criteria before we kind of move? Okay, I don't see any, so. Okay. And so this kind of brings us actually to the other districting data. So we did provide via web map several items that were requested by the commission after the last meeting. And these are just examples of other data that we can map and can utilize, and that you can utilize within this process. And if there are other data sets or maps or anything else that you'd like to see, it would be helpful to send that information to us as soon as possible so that we can get that data available to you. Commissioner Lumley?
I think Commissioner Van Sickle Roberts, did you beat me?
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay, Commissioner Van Sickle Robbins.
Well, I just had one other question that I thought you might be able to answer. One of the public comments that we received in advance asked about whether or not our intention to use whole census blocks needed to be listed as an additional criteria. It didn't seem to me like that needed to be an additional criteria, but I was wondering about your experience on that front.
It's common practice to use census blocks, and there is a lot of reticence to split any census blocks. So, and I think that that was part of the city attorney's comments as well. But for districting and redistricting purposes, we do use census blocks.
So for my question, maybe a reflection on the public input we received earlier tonight about voter turnout and timing the districts around presidential election years. And I was wondering if that would be an appropriate layer of data of voter turnout. Would that wouldn't get us into any trouble with the one criteria to not draw districts for the purpose of diluting voting strength. I think actually would help, I would think, if we had voter turnout. So that would be an interesting criteria to add from my perspective.
Okay, and just for clarity, there is voter turnout for presidential year elections, and then there's voter turnout for the sort of off cycle, the general
Both.
elections. So both would be you would be looking at.
Yep. Thank you.
And then this is just a review sort of the process. Commissioner Van Sickle Robbins, did you have another question? Oh, okay. And then the next steps after the rest of your discussion tonight, we'll be coming back and discussing the mechanics of creating districts, measuring criteria, and then also the public facing mapping tool that we'll be using is called DistrictR. And I think I talked about it at the previous meeting as well. We'll have a demonstration for you at your next meeting, and as well as a guide for folks to be able to use it. And it should, I would think by then, we'll have it public and live as well on your website. Okay.
Commissioner Hanson.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kimmy, for that presentation again. I have a kind of a broad strokes question. So given that our districting commission is different from a lot of other districting and redistricting commissions in that we have 4 districts, but 3 people in each, is there anything that we should be thinking about, like when we're looking at these best practices, when we're looking at these common criteria? Is there anything that we should keep in mind or think about differently, given that we have a slightly different charge?
So in my experience, and I can tell you that I worked previously with the city of Berkeley and then also the city of Oakland, who also have a similar system for voting. And their systems were very similar to what you're going through now. So I don't know that there's anything in particular that I would look at, but I think that you did have some experts who wrote, I think there was a white paper on ranked choice voting in Portland from Moon Dushin at MGGG, and I think it's a good resource to tap into. Commissioner Fleischman.
Thanks. I wanted to go back to the percentage deviation from the kind of perfectly equal numbers, and just ask whether there are a set of common conditions that are accepted kind of both in public policy circles and in community settings, as well as under the law, that that offer kind of extenuating circumstances for what might be greater than expected deviations, right? Some other good that is being accomplished as a result of having, let's say, a greater than, you said the safe harbor was kind of 10%, but most things come in at 5%. So stuff that like falls into the 5% or even nudges above, if it falls over 10%, is there, no extenuating circumstance under which that might be a reasonable districting plan? I'm just trying to gauge what kind of the limits of tolerance are around the population differences in districts.
Yeah, so I would say that 10% is sort of the standard, and when I say that, it really has to do with what's looked at in court cases. And so generally speaking, I have worked with cities, particularly because the census was taken during the pandemic. And so if you had, say, a city that maybe is by itself a small city, but also is home to a large university. And so you would have, in a typical census year, those students would be counted as what they call group quarters. And so, but those students might be counted. And then during the pandemic, a lot of those students simply went home and they weren't there to be counted. So we did work with some of those kinds of situations where we would adjust the deviation for different areas, knowing that in 10 years, those students, in theory, would be there for that census count and then would even that out a little bit. I've also seen in some cities, if they have very large developments, housing developments going into place, that's another situation where you might adjust the deviation slightly. The tricky part to that, though, is that if the building is in process, that's one thing. If it's something that you think may happen in 5 years, then we would suggest that you probably don't include that in your deviation percentages, because that's not a known entity, if that makes sense. Commissioner Chisholm?
Yeah, just to put some numbers to that, if we're looking at 4 districts of roughly 160, 162, 163,000 each, a 10% gap would be 16,000 from the largest to the smallest. The population of Selwood Moreland neighborhood is 13,000. So if you can't get to within one Selwood of equal, I mean, it's a huge range. I think we're probably very likely looking at like 2 or 3%, maybe 5, something special we're trying to accomplish. But if we can't get to 10, it seems we're missing the boat.
Mm-hmm. Commissioner Sexina?
Yeah, no, thank you. I was thinking about that as well, and wondering if it's, as we think of things like voter turnout or, possibly like the percentage of adults who are voting eligible, like is it permissible to consider those things when considering like the population of districts, so that if there is a deviation, is it permissible to consider why we might want some districts to be slightly bigger, slightly smaller, considering turnout and things like that? Is that permissible, or are we not allowed to consider those things?
I mean, I think it's something that you can consider. When we talk about population, we're talking about all the people within the district. And so there is a data set around citizen voting age population, and that's a little bit different. But I would say that you could certainly look at turnout in terms of the data set, and if that helps inform, some of your choices, I think that seems fair.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And Commissioner Van Sickle Robbins?
Yeah, I just wanted to, I thought Commissioner Sexton might say something about this, but Multnomah County just went through a reconsideration and of their districts based on the latest census, and their charter actually says no district will be more than 102% of the population of any other district. And I noticed in one of the comments this evening from the public, they were from North Portland talking about wanting to see us look at how much we could consider the Multnomah County lines for their 4 districts. And I was just wondering, again, as Commissioner Chisholm said, whether that 2% or 5 at the max is, more in line with what we should be thinking?
So there's two pieces. So I would say that, and I think Commissioner Chisholm had asked this earlier, but I would say that trying to adhere to a specific deviation number in this particular process, because it is the first time you're going through it, I think you want to leave that sort of door open as much as possible. If my personal theory on this is that adhering to a specific number when you're creating districts could get problematic when you're talking about, keeping other communities of interest whole. And so I would just say to leave yourself as much flexibility, I think, in that arena as possible. That's my opinion on that.
Thank you, Kimmy. Are there any other questions? I know that this discussion started bleeding into some additional criteria versus the mandated criteria, and that's completely fine. But I just wanted to be sure we at least on the same page around mandated criteria. Commissioner Lumley?
Yeah, Commissioner Hanson asked for the white paper on ranked choice voting, and I'd like to see a copy of that too. So maybe share with everybody. Thank you for making the request, Mr. Hanson.
And there were also a couple of data requests in the chat as well. So I just wanted to acknowledge that we do have those, and we will be sure that those get to the Flow Analytics team. Okay. And Commissioner Siegel?
I don't want to be, thank you. I don't want to be jumping the gun. I was just, given the presentation and given the discussion and the questions, and particularly, as an example, the last one with regard to can the Multnomah County district boundaries be considered as part of the districting criteria? Actually, it's part of the use existing geographic or political boundaries, criteria. That's just an example of one that could be, in my opinion. Procedure-wise, or to get to, I guess, to get to our next step, the question I would have for the whether it's for staff or for the co-chairs, what have you, is that we've had a good discussion about the mandated charter criteria. Just use that for shorthand. How do we proceed? Is it one of basically, as you were saying before, we don't have to ratify the mandated criteria. So is it basically that, okay, we've had a good discussion of the charter criteria. We understand it better now. We'll probably continue to understand it better with additional information and the public hearing. The public hearing on criteria. So process-wise, what's our next step? Because we've talked about the mandated criteria or the charter criteria. Is it one of basically saying, given that, is there a case to be made for any additional criteria, and which ones, and what is the case? And to what level does that rise for acceptance, so that by the end of this meeting, we get to the desired end state of having criteria that we will forward for reaction at public hearing? Thank you.
I think that was a strong summary of kind of where we are in the process and getting that understanding of what is in that baseline, that mandated criteria. And then at this point, the decision point at this point in this junction in the process is really deciding on if at this stage, the commission would like to add or propose draft criteria to take to the public hearing. Now, or if you'd like to primarily just stick with the mandated criteria as it exists, have your public hearing on March 22nd, and then reconsider additional criteria for drafting those maps. Just to kind of summarize the decision points there. Commissioner Manjarres.
Yes, I'm sorry. Can you restate the question? I just want to make sure I'm responding to what you just asked.
Oh, the question, it was really the decision points. So at this point, so there is a public hearing on potential additional criteria on March 22nd. The question at this point is whether the commission would like to propose draft criteria to consider at that public hearing, would like to, at least for now, stick with the mandated criteria and adhering to that, and having the public hearing, having that discussion, and then reconsidering the addition of criteria.
Great. I do want to make a proposal just because I'm having trouble. I'm trying to fit something into like an existing box that is just intuitively problematic for me. Because we do sort of pull out this piece around connecting folks to transportation links, things like that. I would make a proposal for adding criteria for equitable distribution of public goods and services, and that being additional criteria, just to hear the public's feedback on that additional criteria, or whether folks feel like that fits within existing geographic and political boundaries, which I feel like are a little different to me, but also would go with the will of the group. I just put it on the table as something that I think would be easier for folks to understand if it were delineated a little more clearly.
Commissioner, can you repeat the phrasing you use? Equitable distribution of services and?
Yeah, I would say equitable distribution of public goods and services.
Public goods and services. Is there, sorry, Commissioner Siegel, are you jumping back in, or did you mean to put your hand up? Okay. Let's go with Commissioner Chisholm and Commissioner Baldini, followed by Commissioner Wise, then Commissioner Judd. So Commissioner Chisholm, followed by Commissioner Baldini.
I just have a question about how we're going to be doing these public hearings on the criteria. Will we be exclusively just hearing testimony in a one way from the testifier to us? Or can we ask them questions? The reason I ask this is I would actually love to ask them, each person that comes to us, precisely Commissioner Manjarres' question, which is, you know, does your community, whatever that community may be, have more or less? Do you feel underserved with public services? Can we get at that, or are we really just going to be in a one-way receiving flow of testimony?
Sophia, do you?
Yeah, I can chime in here. So I'm working with your co-chairs to create an educational presentation that your co-chairs would give at the beginning of the public hearing that would essentially give an overview of your scope of work, what you're all doing, you know, how this came about, and then dive deep into, not deep, but give a general educational overview of what the district criteria that you are considering is, what you're soliciting, how data is incorporated in this process. And then we can definitely pose a set of questions for community to respond to. So that's something that I can definitely work with your co-chairs to identify. We have some great sets of draft questions that came out of the community engagement framework discussion that I think Commissioner Hanson and Commissioner Judd had brought up. So those are potential starting points for questions. And that leads me to a question, actually a follow-up for Commissioner Manjarres on your proposal. So for the commission, would you like to propose it as criteria that you would like to move forward, or would you more so like to have it more formally kind of posed to the public for feedback?
I feel like we're at the stage where I just like threw it out and we're like kind of end soon. So I wouldn't want folks to feel like they have to make a decision about the implications of that. But I think posing it maybe to the public in criteria, does it make sense to add criteria that calls for equitable distribution of public goods and services and get a sense from folks? Because today we heard on public comment, a lot of folks who are committed to the current criteria for many reasons, many very valid, great reasons. I'm not sure if this even came up in discussion during that conversation. I'm just realizing that the data that I'm calling for, I don't feel fits neatly in the geographic and political boundaries, and it's like stressing me out as I put data in there. So I think just asking the question would be really helpful for us so that we can then, in our next conversation, take the feedback. If everybody says, absolutely not, I hate that, then that's great feedback for us to have. So that's my proposal, I think, is to ask the public the question of whether we should add additional criteria for equitable distribution of public goods and services, and give some examples of that. And a lot of the examples are the data set that I had asked for.
Appreciate that clarification. And thank you, Commissioner Baldini, followed by Commissioner Judd.
Yeah, I 100% agree with the spirit of Commissioner Manhara's point. I think that we absolutely need to consider the equitable distribution of public goods, and I think many of us, at least, who've spoken up are on the same page on that. But again, I'm really nervous about adding anything to what the voters have already explicitly agreed to. So if I wonder, however, I do like the idea of asking the community, like, what do you think of this? Because she's right. We heard from a selection of the community that was very, of one mind at the meeting today. So I wonder, because I know we need to start adopting criteria in order to move forward. Can we adopt the baseline that we reviewed before the meeting and then take this new suggestion to the community, not as a criterion that we've already adopted, but something that we're asking, how do y'all feel about this? Is that possible to do both of those?
You can, so there's no requirement to adopt or ratify the existing criteria because they are mandated under the ballot measure. However, you can certainly communicate and reinforce that that's what those criteria are, and that can be part of, for instance, that educational section, but they already exist, so you don't need to adopt them.
Right,
again.
but I just mean, like, to tell the public, we are definitely going to do these things, and we're going to do them in lots of different detailed ways. And then did you ask, did you also want us to do this additional thing that we will be doing, but did you want us to be more explicit about it? Like I'm hoping we can communicate this really clearly if we move this one forward.
So essentially expand on what it means to actually consider, and perhaps the types of data you would consider under each of the criteria, and just giving that more texture.
Yeah, making it clear to the public how it would change our decision calculus, how this could change the lines depending on whether or not we adopt this additional criterion, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you.
So we have a few hands, so I will say them all in order. So we'll have Commissioner Judd, followed by Commissioner Hanson, Lorente, Siegel, and Wise.
Yep.
Commissioner Judd.
Appreciate it. So going back to and asking the community about this additional criteria, I think there is the perception and then versus the reality, which is, so I agree with Commissioner Manhattan's recommendation. That's what I was trying to get at in terms of what are the municipal expenditures in these categories, because I think we want to be informed as much as we possibly can about the historic trends, right? So because and in what levels of category, because that would help us better approach the community members with data and facts, and have them provide feedback against that. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, if one of the reasons why we're doing this is to provide for more equitable representation, as well as as we've been talking about resources and services to communities, it's going to be important for us to be able to clearly be able to measure those in some way and be able to speak to them in some way. So if we could get that data, I think it's great to take it to the public for their comments. But in order to avoid just getting a qualitative and sort of emotive response, having that data set would be really important.
Thank you, Commissioner. And we will note, so if you have any other questions, not that the speakers have to speak to this, but if you do have other questions you would like to pose to the public, you can drop those in the chat, or you can raise your hand to share them for broader discussion as well. Commissioner Hanson.
Yeah, so this is really appreciating the conversation. This is to Commissioner Manjarres's point, and then also what Commissioner Valdini and a couple of other folks have spoken to in terms of like not wanting to add a lot of additional criteria that may prove cumbersome while also really wanting to honor these data sets. And my kind of offering or idea was, what if we expanded the one line around using existing geographic or political boundaries, which also has the word or and not and in there, to something like using existing geographic, political, and or like public services boundaries, like and or public resources boundaries. So I just dropped that in the chat. That might be kind of an happy compromise or happy medium there of both like honoring the fact that these additional data sets are things that we really want to explicitly call out and explicitly name, while also not adding a whole nother criteria. So just a thought.
And Commissioner Hanson, just a point of clarification. Would you like that posed as a question for public feedback, or would you like to move it forward as a more formal draft criteria?
I don't really care either way. I think at this point, yeah, I think it's fine either way. If it sounds like at this point, we're wanting to just move things forward for public comment. Also a plug for the Community Engagement Working Group.
Plug noted. Commissioner Lorente, followed by Commissioner Siegel.
Yeah, so I had a procedural / mandate question, sort of following up on what Commissioner Valdini, I believe, was driving at. So like, if, for example, in this meeting, we were to vote on additional draft criteria to take to public hearing, specifically the one that Commissioner Manjarres put forward, and then if, you know, at that hearing, we were to get like overwhelming community pushback on that, or thoughtful feedback that causes us to reconsider that, do we have the power to like reconsider or rescind any additional criteria we put forward, or would we be kind of committing ourselves to it indefinitely if we voted to adopt additional criteria here ahead of that meeting?
Okay, I think I understood the process question. So the process question is, if you were to make a draft, is the assumption in your scenario, Commissioner, that this body tonight would adopt a draft or would adopt a formal criteria before going to the public? Because we're rescinding, if it's a draft proposal, of course, you haven't adopted the criteria at all. And if you wanted to get that feedback, I think for the purpose of distinction, we're kind of landing on is because there's this, because there's a desire, it sounds like there's a desire to pose more informal questions to get more specific feedback from the community around defining, for instance, how they think about public services and access to it, what that might look like for the criteria, as well as having discussions around the use of data. To help, using data to help meet the criteria versus adding additional criteria that are distinct, right? Trying to create this distinction between having that discussion, right? And having maybe more considerations brought to the table versus actually having a firmer proposal that's saying, we're pretty sure we'd like to move this forward. We would like your feedback on it. And we're planning on voting on this proposal in the next meeting. So just trying to create that distinction between formality.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Well, what I heard Commissioner Lorente's question to be is, if we put something out there for public comment, can we go back and change our mind later?
Yes,
Is that
I'm
correct?
seeing a
Yeah.
nod head from, I'm seeing Sophia's head nod and thumbs up. Yep. And Commissioner Siegel, followed by Commissioner Wise, then Lumley.
Thanks, and I'll try to keep it brief. I like the idea of going with a draft, get input, and then refine. That's just that's a pretty standard procedure for urban planning in general, and that's how things get done. I'm cool with whether there's mandated criteria only or additional criteria. I would just want to, it's not even a caution, I would just hope that when we consider or when we ask constituents or the general public to consider additional criteria, ask them how that new criteria, or have them think, if one can, about how that might translate into the actual geography of a map. You know, having criteria is great, but then what are you going to do with it? And that's kind of a very general, very loose question, but it's just, you know, to what end? And that's just a general caution I would make. And thank you.
That could also, just building on it, if members of the community do have ideas about different data sets or approaches to mapping, that could also help this body in thinking about how it overlays those data. So I've noted that as a question to the public if they have additional criteria to propose. Commissioner Wise and Commissioner Lumley.
Yeah. Yeah, so I guess with a question to the public around goods and services, I guess I think it's fine for us to pose questions. I also think if we're doing that, we should also be clear about what the impact of that criteria would be. Like in my head, and from, you know, what I know about Portland, there are areas and regions in which they don't receive there isn't adequate services. And so like the maps in my head, like as we're talking, look really weird. They look really weird. And so I guess my concern is that this is a discussion around a set of data points that and internal values that we could hold. I also think that, you know, that we should give communities a chance to advocate for the types of services that they want. I'm afraid that if we have this as a criteria, it would box us into a set of maps that, you know, it could come in conflict with some of the things that communities would want to request, especially being able to elect their own leadership. And maybe for the first time, right? Like we're talking about some areas of Portland. And so, yeah, so I guess, I don't know. I don't know if this is possible, but like, I think there would need to be some education as a part of some of these questions and as to like what that would actually mean for the commission to do its work. But generally speaking, definitely fine with asking the question. But again, I would really want to make sure that we absolutely keep this as a set of data points regardless.
And on Commissioner Manjarres and Commissioner Wise, on your points, I have, at least on paper, written the question as what might it mean to consider the equitable distribution of public goods and services in the consideration of criteria?
Can I clarify? Because I do think, I mean, that it's important to ask it in the way that it would be presented. So I do think making a decision about whether it's added to a particular criteria or just like framed as a full question in the sense of, would the public want to add, and I've already closed my notebook, but more explicit criteria around equitable distribution of public goods and services. And then you can say, we could add it to this thing, or it could be a separate criteria. And just getting feedback on that, I think we want to trust that people know what that means, but we don't want to ask a question that doesn't then translate. This is the expectation, right? It's like, we don't want to ask a question that doesn't translate into something that people thought they were responding to. So I think in as much as we can use the language that would be added, that would be helpful. And I think to this point, just to put a finer point on what Commissioner Wise said, I think that examples of the data that this would include would be really helpful, because I think it'll help people envision within their own communities what that would mean, right? So if I, for example, am a community member in Southeast Portland and I don't have access to fresh food, that's a problem, right? And so I'm thinking, oh, they're going to consider whether I would get access to, they're going to consider what my district would look like, in a sense. Like, we want districts where people feel like their basic goods, services are equitably distributed, or they at least have a better understanding of examples that they could bring to that. And so I do think adding the examples is really helpful to it, but I do think framing it as a question in as much as like what would be added is really important. And again, I think I think the best case scenario of this is that we come back later and maybe nobody responds to that question, and that's helpful data. I would say personally for me, everybody might be like, actually, I don't care about that. I just want voting strength to be the top priority, and that's totally fine. But I think even in the public comment that just was made, there was a criteria for EJ groups, right? Environmental justice communities. Like, people are going to continue to add criteria. I think for us as a body offering to the public comment, I think putting it down to say, here's a question we want you to respond to. We're not going to go ahead and say, this is what we're going to do, and like you respond to it. So I agree with not adopting it in advance. I think posing the question of, if we were to add additional criteria, getting a sense of who would be opposed or who would be activated by that and galvanized to actually show up because they realize that this is a possibility through that is really important.
Thank you for the clarification, Commissioner. Commissioner Lumley, Fleischman, followed by Commissioner Saxena and Baldini. Commissioner Lumley.
Thank you. I said I'm getting a little confused about proposing criteria and just considering other data sets, which I think we can do at any time during this whole process. And earlier I was talking about voter strength on presidential and non-presidential election years. And I do think that's important data. I'm not quite sure if we need to put that out as criteria, but I do like the direction that Commissioner Manwares is going and trying to get at information about equitable distribution of public goods and services. I just don't know what the data looks like. And so it might be good for us to get comfortable with the data, where it's coming from, and do we trust the data? So there's that piece. And then Commissioner Manwares' last comment about, well, maybe there's a way we can put this in context where, look, we know we have this mandated criteria, but we had these independent district commission meetings and we identified 4 or 5 other things, and we want to know what the public thinks about them. That way we're not forcing ourselves into selecting specific criteria that would have to be really difficult to pull that back later. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Fleischman.
Yeah, Commissioner Lumley, I appreciate what you just said, and kind of Commissioner Manjares, how you've refined kind of this idea of like, what are we trying to get at? And I keep on thinking about kind of what's our job. Our job is to kind of draw a set of electoral districts. It's not to go to the next step and then kind of do the work to make this a better community for everybody. So kind of keeping that distinction is, I think, going to be important for us. It's like, how do we draw the electoral districts so that we can encourage more civic engagement, better outcomes for everybody, so on and so forth, is different, I think, than saying, that's our job. Our job is the drawing of the district. So I appreciate asking the questions, but also posing those. And I think this is going to be a challenge for our co-chairs, posing those in a way that the feedback that comes to us is then useful for us in an iterative fashion to keep building and refining our ideas, so that when we come back, we those maps are kind of a concrete manifestation of the feedback that we've received and what's achievable through the maps, not everything we desire, but what we can do through this job that we've been given to kind of create a better society. So I appreciate iterating it and also asking the question, but also trying to pose the question in a way that we're going to get usable feedback for us, because in the end, we're going to continue to wrestle with this. And the more the tighter the feedback we get, insofar as possible, the better we're going to be at doing our job at at the next step. So I really appreciate you starting us off, Commissioner Manjares, with kind of this thinking about, is it a different, is it an additional criteria? Can it be encompassed within the existing? You're right now a little uncomfortable saying it might be, but we can continue to work that angle as well. So really appreciate the conversation as it's evolved.
Thank you, Commissioner. And we'll have Commissioners Saxena, Baldini, and Vincicle Robbins. And I also want to invite Commissioners Green, Kimura, and Van Ness. We haven't heard from you on this topic this evening. So if you do have anything to share, we'd invite you to share that. Commissioner Saxena.
Great, thank you. Yeah, no, I just want to appreciate the last several comments and the comments made by Commissioner Wise, Commissioner Lumley, and Commissioner Fleischman make me a little concerned about adding a criteria without knowing what the data are. Because if we, once we know the data regarding goods and services and amenities, if it becomes clear that there is like a swath of the city that doesn't have the same level of goods and services as other parts of the city, then we're required to draw a district that encompasses other areas rather than making clear that there's parts of our cities that, will likely want to be advocating for those things. So I, without knowing the data, it makes me concerned about putting out a criteria that may sort of box us into drawing lines in certain ways to kind of pull amenities into a district that maybe have been, neglected by public services over the years.
And Commissioner, I believe it, and I think if I understand it correctly, the concern there would be potentially diluting the voting interest.
Common interest, for sure.
The common interest. Thank you. Commissioner Baldini and Commissioner Vincicle Robbins.
Yes, just very quickly, I wonder if it might be appropriate for us to ask the Flow people about the wording and the spirit of this, since they've done this so many times. Have they seen something like this before? How does it usually play out? It might be a good opportunity for us to get their advice if that's appropriate.
So Kimmy has her camera off, but I will see if she's on. Can we give a little bit of perspective on the full conversation?
Well, I'm really supportive of where I believe important to preserve communities of common interest that have historically not had access to public services and amenities. And there are pockets of them around the whole city, not just in one area. And we're going to draw 4 districts that have the opportunity for 3 different council people to be voted in, and there may be all 4 districts may have an alignment with that. I'm thinking about where I live. I live in Burlingame, Hillsdale, and I have a library, and I have a farmer's market, and I have parks, but I have no sidewalks. I have unimproved streets. So, I mean, there's a lot of discontinuity across the city of where you might expect that all of these things are and where they aren't. And so having data sets where we overlay all the farmers markets, or we overlay all the full service grocery stores, or things like that, that I think that maybe data is available on, we can talk in the public hearings with the community members about how we're trying to look at all those things and overlay all those things and try and draw maps that take all of those things into consideration as communities of common interest.
Thank you. Commissioner Manjarrez and then Kimmy.
Yes, and I'll just add, I moved here from New Mexico, and I've done redistricting in New Mexico, and I've engaged in it in Oregon and in Portland. And I think what's really interesting about Portland is because of our unique zoning features, we do have a very different conditions than we would have in other cities, where you can have in your neighborhood access to a grocery store. We don't have the same sort of downtown structures as other places. So I think it's an interesting question, right? And I think to your point, when we talk about communities of interest, sometimes we talk about things like, I'm just adding more clarification. Again, if everybody's like, I don't want to move this question, that's totally fine. I put it on the table as I think it would be a valuable conversation and important for the public. But we talk about business districts, we talk about things like that when we're talking about these different communities. I'm not understanding why something like a farmer's market or a hospital or just the care centers that people have wouldn't be as relevant as those. And so I think part of it is recognizing that when we're talking about how people engage in public policy conversations and these kinds of conversations that get super wonky, and they're going to be very wonky as we get into the maps. I think when you're putting structures in place in these that are more familiar to folks, they're more inclined to engage. And we have business associations. We have a lot of entities. I imagine there's going to be culturally specific service providers who are talking about these services. You know, I think it's part of it is what can folks hang their hat on when they're talking about criteria for these maps and when they're advocating for what they want to see in their own districts. That is not just political geographic boundaries, which again, those to me, and even the examples that were given, are natural boundaries. So folks have been talking about the river because that's the most obvious. But I think that when we think about communities of interest, it could be all encompassing. So even if we didn't ask this question, I agree that we could still include this data. I don't think we're tying our hands by not including it, but I do think that for the purpose of making the invisible visible to folks who don't often get to be part of these conversations, to be able to say, hey, I want to see a grocery store and I want this political boundary to be drawn this way because I could have my grocery store. You know, that's just the way Portland is sort of set up. And that's unique. And so I think that that's why I bring it to the table to say this is something that could be more explicit or it could be more implicit in what we do. And when we're talking about public engagement and how we want to set this up, and we're talking about community engagement, we need to be as explicit as possible in every space that we can, because folks aren't sitting into the nuance of criteria, and they aren't going to as we get into the complications of maps and data.
Thank you, Commissioner. So Kimmy, there were some questions around the availability of data with data sets concerning public goods or services, assuming that those are defined and we could kind of tell you what we mean by that. What does that data availability look like? Have you seen that in prior districting? Has it been rolled into additional criteria for consideration, or has it been have something like this been set aside as additional criteria separately?
So I'm going to see if Alec can weigh in on the availability of data sets, because that's really kind of his arena. I can say that in my work in these last two cycles, honestly, so the independent commissions are sort of a newer thing to this previous districting cycle. Typically speaking, I've not worked with a commission that has added additional criteria to what you have in front of you. Typically speaking, they use those criteria, they're sort of traditional redistricting principles and districting principles, and they kind of move forward with those. And then that's my own experience, at least in this last cycle. Alex, can you speak a little bit to the data sets that might be available?
Yeah, I've been taking a few notes and looking at a few of these just off the top of my head that are actually already in the publicly available web map that I know you probably haven't had a chance to really dive into fully. Things that are already in there are parks, libraries, hospitals, but then some of the things on the list may be a little bit more challenging. Maybe it's not publicly available from the Metro Regional Land Information System or the county. But if we contact county officials, GIS departments, it's maybe something that is retrievable for this process.
And thank you, Alex. And Commissioner Sexton also provided a link to, I believe the Housing Bureau, which also released some data on opportunity mapping as well. Just wanted to flag that as a potential data source. Okay. So Commissioner Chisholm.
I really appreciate the conversation we're all having here, particularly about this public services question. I would encourage you all to think about other ways you might define communities of interest. There are obvious ones, ethnic groups, language groups, school districts, those sorts of things. But just, and I mentioned this by email when I apparently accidentally shouldn't have sent an email. But if you think about sort of how we each the reason I love this kind of work is because you learn so much about your city and where you live, because we all just drive where we drive. We have friends where we have friends. We shop and go to school and worship or whatever it is we do in our lives, recreate. Where we don't go to other places, and this forces us to learn about other places. And I love the city, and this is why it's so much fun. By way of example, I've been thinking a lot about the Linton neighborhood, which is going to matter nothing for us in terms of our math. It's 1,000 people, but the community sits at the bottom on the west side of the St. John's Bridge. Do they belong in the district with the folks at the top of the West Hills, across Forest Park from them? They're on the west side of the river after all. Or do they belong in St. John's, where they shop and play and and hang out, because they're just across the bridge there. It's not to raise that one specifically, but to think of it as an example of the ways that our cultural boundaries often are reflected or are not reflected in our geographic boundaries, the freeways and the rivers and those sorts of things. So I would encourage you, as we're going through this process, to just all think about the ways that the cultural map is different perhaps than the physical map or the economic map, and there are certainly times where it's exactly the same, for sure. But it's an interesting process to go through to begin to sort of put your hands on the map and really look at individual streets and neighborhoods and all that. So I don't have a question or anything to react to, but it's a thought to share.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Lumley.
Thank you. When I started out this conversation tonight, I was thinking, okay, we should put some of our proposed criteria out there for public comment. And now I'm sort of rethinking the whole strategy, and that we have the mandated criteria, and we can consider different data sets throughout this whole process. And we don't necessarily need to put new criteria out there. That's the way I understand it. And the process is that this month we're receiving public comment on the criteria, and then in April we deliberate and make a decision on the criteria, if any. No action means we just accept the mandated criteria. So at this point, I'm leery of proposing new criteria today for certain. Maybe next week if we've given a chance to think about it, but I would think we'd want to look at data sets and see specific information about criteria before we start proposing it for public comment. And I just don't think we're ready to do that right now.
Thank you, Commissioner. So we had some discussion. So we had pretty full discussion around the consideration of the equitable distribution of public goods or amenities. I think there was a proposed revision to that one, as well as services, and getting feedback around that as a consideration as its own additional criteria or considered alongside existing ones. There's also a question more to pose as a framing for public discussion around when considering proposed criteria that might come from the public, also engaging with the question around how to map that. And that's consistent with also the question, the concerns around just being able to have the data, full data, being able to map all of this information as you consider potential boundaries. Are there any other, so I did want to get a sense of whether at this point, anyone would like to propose any additional draft criteria to take into the public hearing, formally as adopting a formal draft criteria to pose. Commissioner Manjarrez, I think I saw you come off mute.
Yeah, can I make a motion for asking the question about additional criteria related to public goods and service or equitable distribution of public goods and services to see sort of where we're at? And again, if a majority of folks feel uncomfortable with adding that, understanding that we're weighing multiple criteria, none of these are going to be perfect, right? Do we want to be more explicit about this or not? But I think part of it is, do we ask the question or not? And again, if the majority doesn't feel comfortable with that, then that's okay. But I do think it's worth getting a sense of whether the majority of folks would like to see that asked to the public.
Okay, there's a motion on the table on considering the question about asking about the criteria for equitable distribution of public goods and services. Commissioner Fleischman, did you want to weigh in on that motion as a second? Okay. And Commissioner Kimura, did you want to say anything about this question before we take the temperature check? And you're on mute, Commissioner.
Yeah. I want to say that this discussion has been very interesting. I also want to say that for the people that I know who live here, I would like them not to feel like the criteria is so closed off that even if they had a good idea, they could not propose it. And that's what I think is important about Commissioner Manjares's question, is that you can propose additional criteria, whether we take it or not. But to tell people, well, this is set in stone and you don't have any other choice, is really insulting. And that's what I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. And Commissioner Lumley, do you have a point on this question?
I do. I'm just not quite sure I understand the difference between proposing criteria and asking the question about the criteria.
So
Somebody
I think
help with
as
that.
Commissioner Fleischman, you're on mute.
That's the point I wanted to make in support of what Commissioner Lumley just said. I'm supportive of asking the question, and as Commissioner Kimura said, not presenting something as kind of a closed case and here's let us tell you what we're doing, but being able to frame a question that allows us to come back and deliberate further. Because right now, like where I want to ask the question, but right now where I'm thinking is I'm looking at communities of common interest as a very expansive clause that allows me right now to think about some of the issues that have been raised and the data we want to collect within that context. So right now, not leaning towards adding another criterion, but making sure that the spirit gets covered in here. And that's of the question Commissioner Manjares is raising. And that's why I'm supportive of asking the question in a way that we get useful feedback that also honors people and doesn't say, hey, we've been given this, so it's case closed. Now this is now we're going to go about our business, but not in a way, and I think a couple of folks have said this, that we are committed to a particular direction when we're still trying to think through kind of the various aspects of this important question that's been raised.
Thank you, Commissioner. So is there any opposition to posing the question to the public ahead of the public hearing and having the discussion at the public hearing around whether to add just read it exactly, whether to add equitable distribution of public goods and services as an additional criteria or potentially adding it as an explicit addendum to an existing criteria?
Yeah, and even
any
just to make that
opposition?
simpler, even to make that simpler, you might just be like, should we be more explicit about public goods and services as a criteria? So just the explicit part, I think, is it? Because like I said, I agree this could be embedded in a lot of things. I similarly think about those, but communities of common interest is a legal term. That's a legal term of art. Like, this is not like, everybody doesn't think of that and think like, oh, what is my community of common interest, right? It's like before when we were talking about engagement and making sure we weren't just that we actually included individuals, because people don't think about themselves in community all the time, right? So I think should we be more explicit about including geographic distribution of goods and services, or how I framed it before, as part of the criteria? And then we can decide as a group what that would look like. If the majority says yes, if the majority says no, it's already included, I know it's included, then that's fine too, but that's more data for us to consider.
I've got that clarification down. So the question is, should we be more explicit about including equitable distribution of public goods and services in the criteria?
So the question that was posed by the facilitator was, you know, does anybody opposed to receiving input on this? And no, I'm not opposed to it.
Do you oppose to asking the question?
I'm not opposed to it.
I think sometimes you might get the input even if you don't ask the question. But I don't see any opposition to asking the question.
Well, sorry.
So,
I was waiting for this.
Commissioner Judd.
Yeah. I'm not sure if we're conflating or sort of, what about the point around adding additional criteria? Are we saying that that's included in this automatically, or are we saying that that's a separate question?
So I think implicit to it is for instance, if you were to pose this question and based on the feedback you got, there was kind of overwhelming support and you talked about it and you came back and deliberated and said, actually, we would like to essentially add criteria. By amending an existing criteria, you've essentially added criteria, and then you would vote on whether to adopt that. So
okay.
This at this point would be mostly setting the table for a discussion with members of the community around, and for instance, I can imagine getting feedback around just the nature, how people think about public goods and services, right? And that also informing, even if you were to say that we don't need to codify it as a criteria, but we would like to pull these specific data sets. For instance, the investment, I think you mentioned community investment, right? If folks are thinking of that as tied to their public services, that also could give texture to some of those data sets you might consider.
Got it. So, because I'm not sure if we're going to get hung up on the use of the word criteria in this process, right? Why can't we just ask how communities, and I think this was maybe the proposal already, why can't we just ask about the equitable distribution of resources? If there's enough information, or if there's enough public sentiment around a discussion about this as it impacts the geographies, why couldn't we just do that as opposed to potentially triggering some community groups just because they're saying you're adding a criteria or you're thinking about adding a criteria?
Are there thoughts on that question? And Commissioner Lumley, I saw your hand up as well.
Well, I think it's a good question, Commissioner Judd, and I'm trying to understand what the motion is and what it means. And the way I understand it is we're going to put this out here for some focused conversation from the public around equitable distribution of public goods and services. And whether or not it becomes a criteria is a question we don't know yet. It could certainly be a very valuable data set that I'm very interested in exploring as well, but it may not necessarily make it into criteria, but we're going to get some focused input from the public and also from us and the city and the team and Flow Analytics, and they might be able to help us with some data sets as well along the way. I'm wondering for the motion maker and second, did I get that correct?
The explicit motion is about asking the explicit motion is about asking that the inclusion of ensuring the equitable distribution of public goods and services in the criteria. However, you can also have a broader discussion around what that means and how people think about public services as well. And Commissioner Mahat, as I saw you come off mute.
Yeah, I'll just clarify that it is asking, again, we can't predict every track everybody's going to go on this. I think it's just the question on the table for the public to respond to is, should access to equitable distribution of public goods and services, should we be more explicit about that in the criteria? Just basically saying it somewhere, right? Because again, it's implicit in some places. That's the question on the table for folks to respond to, and people are going to respond in various ways depending on those are all sort of subjective terms, right? People have their different experiences with public goods services and also whether the criteria should change. We're going to get a lot of different feedback on that, but at least we're going to get from the public. And I think, this goes back to I forget, maybe it was Commissioner Baldini who mentioned that there is a set of criteria that has been approved by the voters, and we're in a stage right now of this process of deciding, like the goal of this phase is to decide, do we add criteria or not? This is a way to get more feedback on whether we add criteria or not, right? We're not at the phase of like, we decided criteria and we're moving on and we hope that people don't say anything different. But I think that this is more just putting it on the table. And this is one that, as I was asking for specific data sets, I felt like wasn't fitting as neatly as I would like into certain criteria. So that's really the ask at this point is, does the public agree with that? Or do they think that this current criteria should be exactly how the voters passed it? And that's what we stick with, and that's fine. So it's really getting feedback on that particular piece, but it's not proposing necessarily at this stage additional criteria. It's how we're explicit about it. We'll have some flexibility in the future about how we lay that out and also what we ultimately adopt.
Thank you, Commissioner. And Commissioner Saxena, and yours may be the last among the last couple comments that we can take before we wrap.
Yeah, no, thank you. I appreciate that. And I guess I also am trying to understand like what the implications would be. So if we had a criteria around equitable distribution of goods and services, does that mean that we would have to create districts that had where the goods and services were equitable, or does it just mean that we have to consider the data? So if someone could clarify that for me, the difference between criteria and data set.
Commissioner Manhattan, you're raising your hand. So, and
yeah, and again, this is more getting to the intent, and Autumn, I definitely trust you to jump in and clarify. I think part of it is we are laying, all of these are not, this is not going to be perfect, right? Everything that we're laying out is a criteria that we're considering as we're laying out maps. So for me, it's how much focus, attention do we give this? How explicit are we about this data? If it's part of a criteria in a category that is risen to the level of we're like listing it as criteria, we consider it in equal weight to some of the other criteria on there. For example, access to transportation, connections, things like that. So for me, it's either way we can access the data, but if the data is embedded in communities of common interest, for example, the category is communities of common interest. So you're looking for the actual communities there and not necessarily at the geographic distribution. Where you put it in the category actually does matter in terms of how you think about the data set. And so that's where, for me, it's like, it's not saying and set in stone, well, it's this or that. That's going to be the entire conversation for all this criteria, right? It's a matter of how explicit are we as we're considering that criteria, and what does the public want us, how explicit does the public want us to be in considering that criteria?
Yeah, no, that's super helpful, and I'm definitely supportive of putting the question out there.
And one exercise that you can do individually and as a broader group as well could be to start mapping those different data sets. We've already, even in this discussion today, I think I've identified additional data sets. And so potentially, just kind of as you said, Commissioner Manhattan, starting to think about what do we think we're potentially gleaning from each of these. Maybe they fit into multiple categories, but potentially mapping them may also help to ground that thinking. And I know that the project team, the team has been thinking about just how to facilitate that discussion as well. And Commissioner Judd, you'll be our last comment before we vote.
So I understand the question, and I'm going to object, and here's the reason for my objection. My concern would be that because we attach the data set to the criteria, that the community is going to get confused, and there's already been clear confusion or public comment that they don't want, some groups that don't want addition of criteria. So if that's going to cause us not to be able to review the data set, I'd rather re-ask the question differently to be able to review the data set before sparking potentially public controversy over adding an additional criteria.
Okay, so we do have opposition to posing the question, and posing the question as is. And I don't think I heard a kind of an amendment line. If there's a move to amend the language,
Yeah, the amended language would just be, should there be a data set around the equitable distribution of resources included in the work that the IDC is doing? That
I'll go.
would be the question to the community without use of the word criteria.
Commissioner Manjarres, is that a friendly amendment?
No, I feel like I understand the purpose of the amendment or where we're trying to go with that. I think that it puts it sort of into more of a binary, right? In the sense of like, I don't want to tie our hands on what data we can look at. And that's what how I heard that, I guess, in terms of how that was presented, is we can't look at this set of data.
No,
But maybe I misunderstood how you framed that.
Yeah, I'm saying that the way you're phrasing it, using the word criteria, actually does handicap us, because it will likely trigger some folks not understanding that it's a proposal, it's a guessing, as opposed to the IDC is looking to establish this new criteria. They're trying to get feedback when we haven't seen the data. What my concern would be is that by adding the word criteria, it's going to cause undue stress, and it will exclude the use of the data set, or exclude us looking at the data set. That's my concern. I would like to see the data set.
Yes, I would like to see the data set too. I think that part of my proposal is getting a sense of the weight that we give that data set. So I don't think the asking of the question of whether we should be more explicit about this as a criteria, especially with that term explicit, actually, if most folks say like, no, I don't want that to be more explicit in that criteria, that doesn't prevent us from using that data. But I do think if we frame the question around data, then we do get into different territory than I'm trying to get into, which to me is more the weight we give this data. And also, again, trusting that folks will be able to understand that the question that we're talking about now is, are we adding additional criteria or not? Should this be more explicit, right? So that's the phase we're in right now. I don't think we should tie our hands or get into the space of what data we can or can't look at. Like, I don't think that would be a space that I would be comfortable going into. And I don't think that's the question at hand around a conversation around criteria.
What I would ask you to do is put yourself, given the public commentary that we've heard so far, where there's confusion around, one, what the IDC's scope is, and two, even the technicalities around that, and thirdly, what an additional and the advising that we're getting so far about adding the conditional criteria, we're getting literally like the Women's League suggested that we shouldn't do that, and there was additional public commentary that said we should not do that. So what would happen if we said we are looking at this as a part of a criteria, which then would spark a conversation around should we or should we not add additional criteria before we even have a chance to look at the data?
And this is
commissioners, I do apologize. We are going to have to take a roll call vote on this one because we do have opposition, and we'll, after this, move on to next steps, and then we'll adjourn for the evening. So the vote, and as a reminder, you can vote yes, no, or abstain. I'll do the roll and just indicate it. You can come off mute. You don't need to raise your hand.
Can you restate the question?
Commissioner, was that you, Commissioner Chisholm? Or, sorry, and I will repeat the question. Yeah, perfect. So the question is, should we pose to the public as a question, quote, should we be more explicit about, quote, the equitable distribution of public goods and services in our criteria? We'd pose this question. It would go to the public and presumably form a cornerstone of the public hearing if members of the public choose to weigh in on it. So again, the question is, should we be posing this question to the public? Should we be more explicit about, quote, the equitable distribution of public goods and services in our criteria? All right, I'm going to start with Commissioner Manjarres.
I vote yes.
Okay. Commissioner Kimura. And I don't see.
Can you clarify,
Commissioner Kamara?
it's a majority vote question?
Oh, this is a simple majority vote, yes. So 7, it would take 7 votes to carry. And I will come back to Commissioner Kimura, Commissioner Siegel,
Yes.
Commissioner Judd,
No.
Commissioner Van Ness,
No.
Commissioner Lorente,
Yes.
Commissioner Chisholm,
Yes.
Commissioner Wise,
No.
Commissioner Valdini,
No.
Chair Saxena,
Yes.
Commissioner Lumley,
Yes.
Chair Vincicle Robbins,
No.
Commissioner Fleischman,
Yes.
and Commissioner Kimura. Do we still have you?
I think she might
And-
drop the call. Yeah, I don't see her in the attendee either.
Okay, so just confirming. So we have 7 votes for yes in the affirmative. So the motion does carry. We'll ask the question and the votes will be recorded in the meeting minutes. Okay. Well, actually, we do have a majority of commissioners present. Sorry, because Commissioner did not vote. Okay. So at this point, that was the only motion for a question proposed. There was a more informal question around just encouraging members of the public to think about mapping when they are proposing criteria, which we can also work into the communications and the approach to managing the public meeting. And give me 1 second. So Adam, do you mind pulling up this final slide? Thank you. And just first, thank you to all of the commissioners just for the thoughtful discussion, for engaging with one another directly on the question at hand, but also thinking more expansively too, and getting back to those values. And just, we will be very thoughtful about providing you with the resources that you have requested and continuing to build out the public engagement plan, the community engagement plan, and making sure that these meetings are both creating those paths to two-way dialogues. So as a next step, we'll be producing the public hearing communications toolkit that will be made available to the public. So we will be working to distribute that through different channels, but we encourage commissioners and anyone who's attending to also share that information with other Portlanders. The public hearing is scheduled for Wednesday, March 22nd from 6 to 8 p.m. And the criteria, so the public comment specifically focused on the criteria will close on April 3rd. This was previously scheduled for March 29th. And then the next regular meeting for the commission will be April 5th from 6 to 9 p.m. And that's where we'll, as a commission, engage around this question or engage around what you heard at the public hearing as well. Okay. And with that, we will adjourn. Oh, I'm premature. Sorry. Commissioner Hanson.
I was just going
Do you have a question?
I was going to ask if there's going to be another meeting of the community engagement working group and or how folks who were not at the last meeting can opt in to participate if they would like.
Okay, so commissioners who were not at the last meeting can write to Sophia to to indicate that you would like to join that. And then we'll work on scheduling a meeting with that working group based on all of the availability. I believe we are planning on another work session now that the community engagement framework is adopted, and we can start to get the feedback around building out the community engagement plan itself. And Commissioner Chisholm.
Just huge props for our ASL and Spanish language interpreters who I can't even believe that they're doing this. The translation of this conversation at the speed at which we're doing it and the technical conversations happening here. So just huge thanks to them.
Seconded, and seeing a lot of reactions too. Thank you for the questions. Thank you for the engagement and the thoughtfulness. We are adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Thanks, everybody.